What's up, guys? This episode we're diving into the basics of Rails system tests. Now, these differ a bit from your integration or your controller tests that we talked about in the previous episode. Those were making direct requests to the Rails app, like get or post or put or patch or delete directly to the Rails app and looking at the response that the Rails app generates. Now, these work really well and they're really fast, but they don't allow you to test things like JavaScript that system tests can allow you to do. These system tests will actually boot up a Rails server and a browser, and then you're controlling the browser and making requests to the Rails app, which is really cool. So just like you test manually in your browser, your system tests can do the exact same thing and allow you to test your JavaScript and your AJAX requests and your other dynamic things that you might have in your app. So this is really cool, but a lot slower and prone to more errors because there's just a lot more involved now. And so that's what we're going to dive into the basics of in this episode. Let's start by creating our very first system test and seeing if we can load up this page on the home page. Now, this system test is defined in your test system folder. Then you're going to create a file in here with the name of what you want to test, _test.rb, just like everything else. But in this case, instead of requiring the test helper, we're going to require application system test case. And then we're going to create a class that matches the file name and that inherits from the application system test case class. And that is defined here in our application system test case file. So this is where the system test class is defined, and you can add new things to this if you want helper methods or anything. You can add them here. Now, this also says that it's driven by Selenium using Chrome, so you can change this to like Firefox, for example, and your screen size, and there's a bunch of other options if you need to. But this is going to be what tells it which browser to boot up. And if you'll notice here, the test helper is required as well. So any things you set up in your test helper will be available in your system tests as well. So in our case, our fixtures and our devised integration helpers are the important ones that will be available in our tests. So let's go build our very first test here. We're going to say visits the index, and we'll say visit projects URL. And something important to note is that you're going to use URL helpers here instead of path helpers. Because we're booting up a browser, we need to include the domain like localhost 3000, and all of that needs to be in the URL. And this is exactly what you want in your URL bar. You might be used to using paths for other tests, but in this case, because we're using a real browser, we need real URLs. So then, once we have that, we can assert something is on the page. So we're going to look for an H1 selector. We're going to look for the text on that to be project. So we should only find one H1 on the page, and we want the text of that to be projects, which should match this right here. Now, if we go to our terminal, we can run Rails test system projects test.rb. You run these tests just like you do with your normal tests, but if you run Rails test, your system test will be skipped because they're slower. Now, as you might have noticed here, our test failed because it was actually taken to the login screen instead of the project's URL. And that's because our project's URL here is actually behind authentication. You have to be logged into an account to view this. So what we can do here is we can say sign in users regular, just like we would do in our integration tests or our controller tests. We need to make sure the user signed in. This is going to go set the cookie in Chrome so that when we visit the project's URL, this test should now pass because we are logged in. So we don't have to go to the login screen first, fill out our information, and then log in. That's going to happen for us automatically. With the devised helper. And it does. So this is great, but it's actually a very heavy test for what we're doing. We don't need to be doing this because we can do it in an integration test faster without a real browser. So what is the difference between these and how should you think about them? Well, system tests, you want to test more of a process, rather than the individual steps. Like, is the user forced to authenticate to visit this URL? You want to do those in integration tests, not in system tests, because your system tests are much slower. So what we want to do here is actually more of a test, like a test can create a project, and we want to do something like this, where we say, we start out on the project's URL, we click on the add new project link, which is up here at the top. And we want to also fill in the title field here, which is labeled with the title. We want to say fill that in with hello test, and we want to click on create project. And so we would click on this. After we filled out hello test here, we would click on that button, and it would take us to the show project URL. So what we would want to do is modify this a little bit, so we have maybe the title of it as the header instead of show project. And so if we went to our project show html.erb, rather than doing this down here, let's grab the title and put it inside of the h1, and let's get rid of that down there. And so now we should see something a little bit nicer, and we can go into our test and say assert selector h1 text is hello test. And if we run this test now, we should see that it also runs through that in the browser. If you watch closely, you should see that it goes to the index a couple times as it does the first test. It reloads it again for the second test, clicks on the add new, goes to the new page, submits that, goes to your create action, and takes you to the show. And so our test here is actually ran through a whole bunch of steps in our controller, in our projects controller in our Rails app, and the browser is just making sure that every one of those pieces is connected like we expect them to. And so that is where your system tests will shine. They're going to help you make sure everything works together as a whole, whereas your controller or integration tests are looking at just a single action and making sure that they run the correct process on the model, whether it's updating it or creating it or deleting it. They're doing some more fine-grained stuff. Your system tests need to be higher level and thinking about going through a set of steps instead. So we can also walk through the process of updating a record. So let's go ahead and set up a project up here. So we'll say projects 1, and I believe we have a projects fixture called 1, and we do. So let's go ahead and say test can update a project, and we'll visit the project URL for @project, and that will start us out on this page. We will be able to click on edit. We will fill in title with, let's do the hello test again, and click on update project. So if we click to edit, we want to click on this update project, and we should assert selector h1 text is hello test. So if all of that works, we should be able to go through the edit process now and go through seeing the edit page, updating the forms, clicking the button, and then updating our project to the correct name. So if all that worked, we should be good, but we didn't find the edit button. And so here we can take a look at this screenshot and see what happened. If we open up that screenshot, we can see that we were not logged in again, and that was the issue with our test. So those screenshots come in handy when you are working on something. You can verify that what was on the screen at the time was probably not what you were expecting, and so these screenshots are automatically taken for you in the Rails system test, and that's not something that would be possible in integration tests because there's no real browser to view what you're looking at. All you have is the raw HTML or JSON that Rails would give you back. So there we go. Everything works now, and we're able to update a project. We can do basically the same thing for deleting a project. So we'll say can delete a project, and we'll sign into the user. We will visit the project URL. We will click on edit, and then we will click on destroy, and we also need to click on confirm to submit that confirm. So we'll say click on confirm, and we should assert selector projects, because once we delete one, we should be taken back to the index page. So let's try running this test and seeing what happens. And all of our tests passed, and everything worked as we expected it to. You'll also notice here that we see multiple capybaras starting Puma. This is actually because of the parallel tests in Rails 6. These are booting up 4 different databases, 4 different Rails apps, and 4 different browsers to go run your tests against, which is really cool. This is going to make things run very quickly and complete things in 1/4 the time in theory. Now I want to mention we also have access to the page variable in our test here, and we can say things like page.acceptConfirm and a block if you're using the regular browser modal dialog for confirms. In our Jumpstart template that we're testing against right here, when we click on one of these and click destroy, this is actually a Bootstrap modal that's displayed instead of the browser modal. And so if you want to actually accept the browser modal, you can say page.acceptConfirm, and inside of there do your click on the destroy link. And that will go ahead and make sure that it's done correctly for you. So I'm going to uncomment these and leave that there for reference, and that's how you would confirm a dialog in a system test. So the other things that you can do in here as well is you can say things like click on match is first. So if you happen to have destroy links in the index page, you can match the very first result that it matches instead. So of all the links that might say destroy, you can get the first one, you can get the last one, whatever you might want there. Those are very helpful if you have duplicate things on the page. So that's it for this episode. In the future, we're going to be using system tests to actually test some JavaScript functionality. We're probably going to build something with Stimulus and then go and make sure that when we type in a form, maybe it does a character counter. We can verify that character counter is working as well. There's lots of options we can do. We can make AJAX requests as well. All kinds of different things, which we will talk about in a future episode. Until then, I will talk to you guys later. Peace.